They grew up on the same quiet street where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. The kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches and children stayed out until the streetlights flickered on. And if you had asked anyone back then about Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks, they would have smiled and told you the same story about two kids who found each other early and never let go, about a bond that looked steady, familiar, almost reassuring in a world that changes too quickly. And for years, that's exactly what it looked like. From shared school hallways to late-night phone calls, from small-town football games to whispered plans about a future neither of them could fully see yet, they moved through life side by side as if nothing could ever pull them apart, and when they finally got married, it felt less like a beginning and more like something that had always been meant to happen, something inevitable, something safe. But years later, when investigators began piecing together what really went on inside that marriage, the story people thought they knew started to fracture in ways no one expected. Because the truth was not hidden in one moment or one mistake, it was buried across years of silence, small details overlooked and behaviors explained away. And by the time anyone realized what those signs meant, the damage had already been done. The kind of damage that doesn't just change lives, but forces everyone who hears it to question how well they truly know the people closest to them. And what's even more unsettling is how ordinary it all seemed at the start, how easy it was to believe in something that felt so genuine, because nothing about their story, at least in the beginning, suggested the kind of ending it would eventually have. And that's exactly what makes this story so difficult to ignore. Because it doesn't begin with fear or suspicion, it begins with trust, the kind people build their entire lives around, the kind that makes you feel certain you understand someone completely, until one day you realize you never really did, and the moment that realization sets in, everything you thought was real begins to feel uncertain. Every memory takes on a different meaning, every decision feels heavier, and the question that lingers long after the truth is revealed is not just what happened, but how it was allowed to happen for so long without anyone truly seeing it. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive quietly, it came with consequences that couldn't be undone. And by then there was no going back to the version of the story everyone once believed, only the reality that replaced it, a reality that would leave a permanent mark on everyone connected to it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story about love or betrayal. It's about the space in between, the moments people ignore, the signs they dismiss, and the truth that waits patiently until it can no longer stay hidden. And by the time it finally comes to light, it changes everything, and by then, it was already too late. So what really happened inside the marriage of Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks, the couple everyone believed had already figured life out before most people even knew where to begin? Was it truly the kind of love story people admire from a distance and quietly hope to find for themselves? Or was there something far more disturbing hidden beneath the surface that no one thought to question until it was impossible to ignore? And how did Daniel, a man described by neighbors as dependable, polite, even protective, manage to carry a secret so heavy without it ever slipping into the open? How did someone so familiar become someone so difficult to understand once the truth began to unfold? Because when people later looked back, they didn't just see a marriage, they saw a series of moments that suddenly felt different, conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but now carried a strange weight, decisions that once made sense but now raised uncomfortable questions. And what made it even more unsettling was how easily everything had been accepted as normal, how no one felt the need to look closer, because nothing on the surface demanded it. Yet as investigators started asking questions, small inconsistencies began to appear, details that didn't quite align, patterns that suggested there was more beneath the calm exterior Daniel presented to the world, and the deeper they looked, the harder it became to separate the man people thought they knew from the one revealed through evidence and quiet observations gathered over time, leaving behind a question that no one could answer with certainty. Was this something that developed over the years, shaped by circumstances no one else could see, or had it always been there from the very beginning, hidden behind a carefully maintained image that no one had reason to doubt? Because if that were true, it would mean the story of Emily and Daniel was never what it seemed, not even in those early days people remember so clearly. And that possibility is what makes this case so difficult to process, because it challenges the idea that time reveals everything. Sometimes it only hides it better. And to understand how something like this could remain unnoticed for so long, to understand how a relationship that looked so certain could lead to so many unanswered questions, we have to go back to where it all. Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks met long before anyone would ever question their story. Back when life was simple and their world stretched no further than the quiet streets of the neighborhood they both called home, a place where kids rode their bikes without worry and families knew each other by name. And in that environment their connection felt natural, almost expected, like two paths that were always meant to cross. Daniel was the quiet one, the kind of boy who didn't speak unless he had something to say, who watched more than he participated, who seemed comfortable existing in the background while others took the spotlight. And people often described him as polite, well-mannered, even thoughtful, but also distant in a way that was hard to explain. While Emily was everything he wasn't, open, friendly, the kind of person who made others feel at ease within moments of meeting her, she had a way of bringing people together, of filling silence with laughter. And it didn't take long before the two of them formed a bond that stood out to those around them, not because it was dramatic or intense, but because it felt steady, dependable, like something that would last. And as the years passed, that connection only deepened. What started as childhood friendship slowly turned into something more meaningful, shaped by shared experiences. Late-night conversations, and the comfort that comes from knowing someone for so long that they begin to feel like part of your identity. By the time they reached their early 20s, Emily and Daniel were no longer just close. They were inseparable, the kind of couple people pointed to as an example of what lasting love should look like. And from the outside, everything about their relationship made sense. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic turning points. Just a gradual progression from one stage of life to the next. And yet years later, when people were asked to reflect on who Daniel was back then, a few would hesitate not because they had clear answers, but because certain memories didn't sit quite right anymore. Small moments that once seemed insignificant now felt different when placed in a new context, like the way he reacted when things didn't go his way, or how particular he was about routines, about order, about control in subtle, almost unnoticeable ways. It wasn't something anyone could point to as alarming at the time, but it was enough to leave an impression that only made sense much later, because Daniel didn't just care about the things around him. He needed them to follow a certain structure, a certain predictability that gave him a sense of stability. And over time, that need quietly extended into his relationship with Emily, not in ways that were obvious or easy to challenge, but in small expectations. Unspoken rules that slowly shaped how they interacted, how decisions were made, how their lives moved forward together, and Emily, trusting and committed, adapted to that dynamic without fully realizing how much it was influencing her. Because from her perspective, this was the person she had known her entire life, the person she believed she understood better than anyone else. So when Daniel eventually asked her to marry him, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. Just the continuation of a story that felt like it had already been written long before that moment arrived. And even now, looking back at that decision, many would say it made perfect sense, because everything leading up to it pointed in that direction, everything except the small, quiet details that no one thought to question at the time. And still, she said yes when he proposed. At first, the marriage between Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks looked exactly the way people had always imagined it would: steady, comfortable, built on years of shared history that gave it a sense of certainty most relationships never reach. They settled into a routine that felt familiar, a home that reflected stability, quiet evenings, predictable schedules, the kind of life many people spend years trying to create. And from the outside, nothing seemed out of place, if anything. It appeared even stronger than before, because now it carried the weight of commitment, the promise that everything they had built together would continue without interruption. But over time, small changes began to surface, subtle at first, easy to overlook. Daniel became more particular about how things were done, how the house was arranged, how plans were made, and while it could be dismissed as preference, it slowly turned into expectation, then insistence. And eventually something that shaped nearly every part of their daily lives. Emily adjusted the way she spoke, the way she reacted, even the way she made decisions, not because she was forced to in any obvious way, but because it became easier than questioning it, easier than creating tension in a relationship that had always felt so certain. And as those patterns settled in, something else began to change. Her connection with the outside world started to fade, calls to friends became less frequent. Visits to family shortened, conversations that once came naturally started to feel measured, as if every word had to pass through an unspoken filter before it was said. And when people noticed, they didn't immediately see danger, they saw distance, a shift they couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either. Friends would later say she seemed quieter, more withdrawn, as if something was weighing on her in a way she wasn't ready to share. And family members sensed it too, a difference in her tone, in her presence. Something that felt unfamiliar compared to the person they had always known. Yet whenever they asked, the answers were always the same. Everything was fine, just busy, just adjusting, just life moving forward the way it tends to do. And for a while that explanation was enough, because there was no clear reason to believe otherwise, until the night everything changed, a night that didn't begin with anything unusual, no warning. No clear sign that it would become the turning point people would later focus on. But as the hours passed, something shifted, something that would leave a lasting mark on both of them. And by the time that night came to an end, whatever remained of the life they once shared had been altered in a way that could not be undone. And after that night, Emily Carter was never seen the same way again. When authorities finally became involved, the version of events Daniel Brooks presented seemed clear at first: calm, structured, delivered with the same controlled composure people had always associated with him. But as investigators began to examine the details more closely, small inconsistencies started to appear, the kind that don't immediately raise alarm but become impossible to ignore once they begin to stack. His timeline of that night shifted in subtle ways. Certain moments didn't align with what could be independently verified, and the more questions he was asked, the more those gaps seemed to widen rather than close. It wasn't anything dramatic on its own, but taken together, it created a picture that felt incomplete. And that's where the focus of the investigation began to change, because what initially looked like a situation that could be explained through circumstance slowly started to suggest something else entirely, something more deliberate. As officers revisited the home Emily Carter and Daniel shared, they paid closer attention to the environment, the placement of objects, the condition of the space, details that might have been overlooked at first but now carried new significance. And alongside that, Daniel's behavior drew increasing attention, not because it was openly alarming, but because of how measured it remained, how controlled his responses were even as the situation intensified. A level of composure that felt unusual given the circumstances. And as digital records were reviewed, another layer began to emerge: patterns in communication, gaps in activity, traces that hinted at movements and decisions that had not been fully accounted for. Each piece on its own could be explained, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore, leading them to consider the possibility that what happened that night was not accidental, not a sudden moment gone wrong, but something that may have been building over time, something shaped by the same need for control that had quietly defined parts of Daniel's life long before this point. And yet, despite growing suspicion, there was still no single piece of evidence strong enough to confirm it beyond doubt, leaving the case suspended in uncertainty. Where questions outnumbered answers and every new lead seemed to circle back without resolution. And for a time, it appeared as though whatever truth existed might remain just out of reach, buried beneath layers of explanation and uncertainty, until investigators came across something that had been there all along, something so ordinary it had blended into the background, something hidden in plain sight. What investigators uncovered next changed the direction of everything they thought they understood about Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks, because what had once looked like a series of disconnected inconsistencies suddenly formed a clear and deeply troubling pattern. Hidden within records and fragments of Daniel's private life was evidence that suggested this was not a situation that unfolded in a single moment, but something that had been quietly developing over time. For years he had been maintaining a version of himself that the outside world accepted without question, while another side of his behavior remained carefully concealed. And as those layers were pulled back, a different picture of Daniel began to take shape, one defined not by the calm and dependable image he presented, but by a need for control that extended far beyond what anyone had previously imagined. Investigators found indications of deliberate planning. Decisions made in advance rather than in reaction, patterns that pointed toward intention rather than coincidence, and the deeper they looked, the more difficult it became to reconcile the man described by neighbors and friends with the one revealed through evidence. Because this was not simply a case of a relationship falling apart, it suggested something much more calculated, something rooted in a mindset that had been hidden behind years of normalcy. And as those findings came together, the narrative shifted in a way that left little room for doubt about the nature of what had happened. This was not love in the way people had always believed. It was shaped by control, by an overwhelming need to dictate outcomes, to manage every aspect of the environment around him, including the person he had spent most of his life with. And for those who knew Emily, that realization carried a weight that was difficult to process, because it meant that the person she trusted most, the person she built her life around, had been hiding this reality all along, presenting one version of himself while concealing another that only became visible when it was too late to change what had already been set in motion. In the end, the truth about what happened between Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks did come out. Not all at once, not in a single moment that made everything clear, but piece by piece, through evidence, testimony, and the slow process of connecting details that had once seemed unrelated. And as those pieces came together, a version of events emerged that could no longer be explained away or misunderstood. It forced everyone who had followed their story to confront a reality that felt far removed from the one they had believed in for so many years. Yet even with that clarity, the outcome did not bring the kind of closure people often expect, because for every answer that surfaced, another question seemed to take its place. Questions about when things truly began to change, about whether there was ever a point where the course of their lives could have shifted in a different direction, or whether everything that happened was already set in motion long before anyone realized it. And for those who knew Emily, those questions carried a deeper weight, because they weren't just trying to understand what happened, they were trying to understand how something like this could exist within a relationship that once felt so certain, how the signs that now seem so clear could have gone unnoticed at the time, and whether those signs were ever truly visible or only became apparent in hindsight. And as time passed, what remained was not just the memory of what took place, but the lasting impact it left behind, a reminder that even the most familiar connections can hold complexities that are difficult to see from the outside, and that understanding someone completely is far more uncertain than most people are willing to admit. Because stories like this do not end neatly, they leave space for doubt, for reflection, for the kind of questions that stay with you long after the details fade. How well do we really know the people closest to us, and how many warning signs do we choose to overlook in the name of love? You think the signs in the story of Emily Carter and Daniel Brooks were there all along, quietly present in ways that only make sense when you look back? Or do you believe this was something no one could have truly seen coming until it was already too late? Let me know what you think in the comments, because your perspective might be very different from someone else watching this, and those differences are what make conversations like this so important. And if you found this story unsettling, the kind that lingers in your mind long after it ends. Then the next one will take things even further, because there are cases that challenge what we think we understand about trust, relationships, and the choices people make, stories that stay with you in ways you don't expect. So make sure you subscribe for more real-life crime stories that stay with you, stories that don't just tell you what happened but leave you questioning how and why it ever did.